we had a real allergic reaction to the idea of profits for a period of time. In the end, though, we can't do anything good if we're not bringing in money and running the business. We just had to kind of shed the sense of guilt over having surpluses and move on. As a co-op, we're benefiting from that now.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I am Anuj.
And you're listening to the Just Good Business podcast.
It's a show about amplifying the voices of social enterprises, the humans behind them, and the journey they are on.
Join us as we learn from Nova Scotia's social enterprises,
hearing what inspired them to take the unusual path for doing social good, creating prosperity beyond profit.
Let's explore Nova Scotia's world of social entrepreneurship together.
Who knows? You may be closer to running your own social enterprise than you think. Just Us is a worker-owned cooperative made by and for people who love coffee. They are our own Nova Scotian importer of fair trade coffee and now tea, sugar, and chocolate bars. Founded in 1995 and with their head office located in Grand Prairie, they would like to say they are more than a roastery. They are an inclusive and equitable point of commodity exchange marketplace between the Global South and Global North.
In this episode, we'll be learning with you as we chat with Joey Pittoello, the General Manager at Just Us. Joey has been with Just Us since 2010. He lives near Wolfville with his partner Sarah and their 2 children on their small organic farm. He's a chocolatier, he's an organic farmer, he's basically living the dream. Let's dive right in. Joey, I have to say, very excited to be having this conversation, not just because Just Us and Just Good Business are a match made in heaven from a naming perspective, not just because I have 3 young children and caffeine gets me through the better part of many a day, but because of the organizational mission and who you are as a business, as an entrepreneur, and as a human. So let me start off with a bit of a softball here for you, Joey, and would love to hear the Just Us origin story. Tell us about how you came to be as an organization.
Yeah, well, I'll do my best. Our founder, Jeff Moore, would have all kinds of details around that. But the way we started off was really, it was the brainchild of Jeff Moore, and certainly his wife, Deborah Moore, was the other half of the reason why it all happened early on. Both Jeff and Deb were social workers. And back in the early 90s, Jeff had been kind of exploring this idea of coffee, and he'd been a huge social justice guy for his whole life, really, and was big into the folk music scene, and all these kinds of things kind of came together. Folk music, just kind of this grassroots kind of social justice piece that always kind of rung true for him. And from my understanding, he was coming out of having just they had started a local L'Arche community here in Wolfville, and coming out of that, he had decided to really look deeper into what it would mean to start a coffee business that could really bring that social justice piece to the forefront for him. He found himself down in southern Mexico during the Civil War there in the Zapatista communities, searching for coffee, searching for the potential for a business, searching for a sense of understanding of the struggle of the folks that were in that war. And in the end, he returned here to Canada, and to make a long story short, him and his wife had a conversation, him and Deb, and they decided to remortgage their house and buy the first container of coffee that would be required to get this business off and running. And with that, Just Us kind of started. So they had to bust a hole in the side of their house. That's where they put the roaster in. That's where the first container arrived. They filled their basement with coffee. Their house became a cafe. Deborah had a lot of recipes. They were doing baking, and that's kind of where the origins of it started. But it really was right from the beginning, a worker co-op was the concept, and that came out of that deep sense of social justice and economic justice that both Jeff and Deb felt, and that's where the beginnings of the organization started.
That's so wonderful. What an entrepreneurial journey. It's nothing like remortgaging your house and then proceeding to punch a hole in the side of said house. It's got to feel amazing. Well, what about yourself? Tell us about Just Us Now. I mean, so you're obviously not in that house anymore. It's now an artist boutique or something like that. So what about Just Us Now?
Just Us certainly has grown over the last 26, 27 years. We currently are located in Grand Pre. We turned an old farm market off exit 10 into the current roastery and cafe and office building that we have here now. And at this point, the values, the original kind of concept behind Just Us is still really rings true for all of the 25 or 26 worker members that we currently have. We've gone from the original four back in 1995, 96 to about 25 or 26 folks now. I don't know the exact number. And we've got about 55 to 60 employees generally. And we continue to have really strong direct ties with all the producer organizations that we buy coffee from, who are all also co-ops or democratically organized grower organizations. Over recent years, we've really continued around the social justice piece here in our local community a little more deeply, as we've kind of solidified that value chain internationally and really built good, strong relationships. Businesses, I find, can come and go in different focuses as they go through their journey. And so we're kind of back focused on the concepts of decolonization here in our local community, building relationships with local Indigenous communities around us, the Napolis Valley First Nation and Glooscap First Nation in particular, as well as the Nova Scotia Native Women's Association a little bit. Just those kinds of relationships, the newcomer population here. There's been a renewed focus on the workers in our co-op and involving them and democratic power amongst those workers in our organization. So it's kind of been a bit of a rejuvenation over the last 6, 7 years, I'd say, kind of on a more local context.
What an intriguing story, Joey. A business model that integrates social, environmental concerns and impact at the very core. How do you measure your success? It's a very unusual business model, workers cooperative,
Mhm.
fair trade, and yet you, I suppose, make money. How do you balance all this? Are there challenges in balancing all these different pieces of your business model?
There's always challenges, even if you're not trying to balance those things, but certainly adding those other aspects have been tricky all throughout the history of the organization. For us, I think it really lies in the relationship we create within the community of our worker co-op and how the training, the educational opportunities that we create for those worker members, for example, they come from all different, it could be baristas, we've got roastery members, we've got sales reps, we've got, management team members, all are part of the worker co-op and all have ownership stakes, not only from a typical kind of, shareholder point of view, but from, a sweat equity point of view as well as a worker co-op. So I think balancing the things all comes from the individual's desire. Like in our worker co-op, each individual has their own focus, whether it's maybe sustainability, maybe it's local community engagement, maybe it's business acumen. But when you bring that kind of complex group of people together and are creating a democratic model of business, it's complex, but you manage to get all these things coming in at the same time. And there's moments, like I said, where balance shifts back and forth depending on the situation, depending on the environment around us, as far as business or the community goes. But generally, it's that engagement with those worker members that ultimately allows us to keep that thing balanced because they're all members of our community around us. They're all members of our work community, and they all have this mix of sustainability, social justice, and kind of business values that really allow us to mix it up into it's a really good recipe, and in the end, it's a well balanced recipe that keeps things moving forward.
As we know, social enterprises of different kinds often have a major challenge in terms of investments. And you alluded to that, how Jeff and Deb took a second mortgage. And that's not easy for any social enterprise to do. Um, Tell us a little bit about your numbers. What does your investment currently look like? I hope the second mortgage is paid for now. But how do you manage investment, debt, or workers' equity? What kind of balances do you manage there?
Yeah, well, and that was a difficult thing to manage at the beginning of the business. Like any new business, any small business, but particularly as a worker co-op, there was a challenge in that the local banks, local, even government-backed subsidies and opportunities for fundraising, all really were challenged by this idea of a worker co-op. And well, who do we write down as the one's assets that are ultimately responsible for this debt, right? And even the local credit union, that we were with for a number of years really was challenged with this, but they did come to the table. But in the end, Jeff and Deb had to take the financial risk. And that right from the get-go, it made it challenging, I think, as the business progressed to really sort out, that difference in risk that existed, right? Even though you're trying to be a worker co-op and it's a democratic structure, there were challenges there that were certainly overcome. Ultimately, Jeff and Deb are retired, and that's been dealt with long ago. But it's challenging, and so for us now about 5 or 6 years in, we did a CDIF. Now, this was a really interesting, innovative kind of program at the time here in Nova Scotia, almost alone. And in fact, a lot of provinces have learned from that model and have adopted similar programs. But it allowed for local investment at a significant tax rebate when it came to income taxes for investors. And that was a big piece of our beginning growth, was because of the CDIF program ultimately. And we were, I think, maybe the first real CDIF success story that was of significant size, and certainly continue to be kind of a well-sustained, maintained organization that came out of that. We don't run CDIFs anymore. And so right now our investment really, we've probably got roughly $2 million worth of local investment, including our worker co-op members, in our business. We're in the stage now of paying that down over time as the tax rebates kind of dry up, and as people get older, they're requesting that money back, and we're returning that money, roughly $100,000 to $150,000 a year right now. So it's a significant cash flow responsibility of ours, but it's been of huge consequence for us over the years. Now, at the moment, I said before, we're not really taking advantage of CDIFs anymore, mostly because they're not really accessible to us anymore. We're not a startup business anymore, and also some of the rules have changed a little bit within the province, the Treasury Board. So we've moved really to our bank as a means of securing any additional loans as we move forward. In trying to finance some of our own smaller investments through our own cash flow. So it's become easy, quote unquote, to secure loans through our bank branch now that we're a secure and established business. There's really no questions asked about worker co-op anymore. But in those first 10, 15 years, it was a really challenging thing to finance the growth of the business, because it did grow quite quickly for a period of time as well. Right now, our goal is, and I can't speak to the exact ratios financially speaking, but our goal is to continue to pay down our local investors, with the idea of financing future through our own worker co-op shareholder model, and not including like a local investment from non-worker co-op members. But it's a really interesting, we could go into detail on that. I won't today, but it's actually two co-ops we've created. There's an investor co-op in Just Us, and then there's the worker co-op. And we kind of have married the boards to some degree, to allow for them to work well together. But over time, there's likely going to be a disbanding of the investor co-op once the debt is paid down by Just Us.
As often Matt says, prosperity beyond profit. Here is a story that you just now shared. Give us a few numbers around your revenue, and also how do you manage the surplus? As worker owners, what kind of participation do they have in the risk and the return from that profit?
I can speak more specifically the last 10 years, 10 or 12 years since I've been here, but I know over that period of time, we've gone from roughly, a $5 or $6 million business to currently this year we're projecting somewhere around $11 million in sales. And that comes from a combination of our own cafes, which are only two at this point, but are significant buyer from our kind of wholesale business, as well as businesses of their own, and many other kind of from the grocery store chains all the way to the local cafe that's buying coffee from us. And we've had a couple of years where there have been no profits, but for the most part, every year we've brought a surplus in. And what we've created here at Just Us as a worker co-op is the ability for workers on a whole to benefit from surplus when they exist, but not only our worker members. So right now, for example, if we had $100,000 in surplus, $20,000 of that, 20%, goes to worker members. And so it would be divided equally because labor is what we use as a means of proportioning shares in a co-op. So in a worker co-op in particular, it's not how many dollars we have invested in the worker co-op. It's one member, one vote, and one equal proportion of the profit sharing, no matter what you've got invested in the co-op. So there's that 20%. We also share back 10% of surplus to our producer partner organizations in the value chain. And this typically goes towards capacity building projects, whether it's community based or environmentally focused or even quality or product development focused. It's really about taking some responsibility for the wealth that's been stripped from these communities over the centuries of colonialism and slavery and various stealings of wealth in these communities, and a very small part trying to pay that back in a sense, or we feel it's more to co-responsibility for that situation. But it's also because these organizations are part of our business. If we didn't have people growing and selling us the coffee that's green, the green coffee, we wouldn't be able to have a business that we have. And so 10%, and this is not set in stone. This can be changed. It hasn't been changed for a number of years, but it's the 20%, 10%, and then we have a 5% of the surplus that's then shared amongst all workers, whether you're a member or not. And this kind of comes in the form of a cash bonus kind of at the end of the year, typically. If it was $100,000 surplus, it'd be 5,000 gets shared amongst all the workers based off the working hours. 10% goes back to producer work that they're doing, and then 20% would be basically it's put back in as investment in Just Us, but it's worker member money that if they were to leave the co-op to go on to other things, they would take with them. And then the other thing we're always measuring is what's the social impact of some of the expenses that we have. So sponsorship, we really try to focus our sponsorships on community development, community focused things, less kind of advertising and more on what good kind of positive community efforts are we supporting with our sponsorships. Those sorts of things are taken into consideration. And ultimately, we're only aiming for roughly a 4% surplus based off our total sales. So in the case of $10 million, we're looking at somewhere in the range of $400,000 surplus that we'd like to share in the way that we say. And obviously, with the assets we have, it takes about $100,000 to $150,000 just in capital investment every year just to keep everything running and maintained. So it's not like we're trying to maximize profits and how the old adage would go. It's maximizing the impact we're having in various parts of our community, both globally and locally.
Your intentionality around this social impact, be it the producers, be it the local community, and be it your worker members and just workers, is just fascinating. And how it breaks down to the intentionality and the whole nuances and details of this design is just fascinating. Thank you, Joy.
It sounds like there's, I hope you have an octagon or decagon desk, because it sounds like there's quite a bit that happens off the side of the desk as well. When you're talking about decolonizing basically the industry when it comes from an international perspective, and also doing some really intentional work locally within community, it's such important work, and it's so deep rooted that that in itself can be incredibly and importantly time consuming. And if you throw on top of that the fact that you work in a very competitive environment, right, when it comes to coffee,
Mhm.
coffee and beverage market.
Yeah.
So, what's your approach to survive and thrive while being able to recognize that you're working off of a Decacon desk?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if I have the answer to that one yet, but I mean, the reality is, admittedly, we had a bit of a reckoning probably 6, 7 years ago now. And we really recognized that we needed to actually up our game as far as our business skills and the business understanding, if we were going to keep doing the good work that we want to do. And it really comes from this philosophy of we have all these interests in our community and globally. We're organic certified product, not because organic certified, being, administered by the CFIA is something we think is lovely, but because organic regenerative agriculture that builds soil, that mitigates climate change is an important thing. We have lots of people that are passionate about that. We have people that are passionate about the social justice side. And so we have things we want as a worker co-op to spend money on that don't necessarily have to do with selling coffee, right? At least not directly. And so there was a point where I think we were interested in these things, and we were doing these things that kind of, instead of off the side of the desk, they were, taking up a good portion of the desk. And we started to recognize that, well, if we didn't get really, really good at the business that we do, we weren't going to be generating the kind of surpluses we needed to take on those projects. So that was something that we've built we've added more people to our team over the last number of years. We've tried to encourage people to be passionate about their professional development as well, like the opportunities to move from different roles where they start in the business into other, not necessarily, moving up is not something that is necessarily what everybody's looking for, but moving sideways, learning new skills. Because what we have recognized in our co-op is that because we're retail, because we're sourcing from origin and shipping, and have direct relationships, because we have a sales team and all the kind of administrative piece, because we manufacture, there's all kinds of experiences within our co-op that are really interesting to learn. And so we've been developing a lot of professional skill sets, which have allowed for the business to thrive. So that's been part of why we've seen a resurgence in the local kind of focus in our engagement. Partly it's COVID has required us to do that because we haven't been traveling to visit partners in South America, Latin America in general, and Africa since that happened very much. But developing the business, engaging people in the business, what's happened is we've been able to be more, I think, specific around what these side desk projects are going to be. The beauty of this is that I don't need an octagon shaped desk because we have folks that are tuned in and aligned. This is the other piece. When we got passionate about our business, we also got really razor focused in on how do we align all these people in the same direction. And when we start to build that culture, when we start to build that understanding and alignment, and when we start to build those capacities in people, people that aren't, the manager or the CEO or the GM or the business development manager or whatever, can actually spearhead some of these side projects because they've been by the membership and management team kind of recognized to be aligned with some of the values and the goals we have as a membership. And so, you know, beyond the check in that happens to make sure that alignment remains, different people can start to take on those responsibilities and they build interesting responsibilities, I guess, within their role as a result of that. Right. So there's a richness that comes when you're able to do that and people are able to take on these interesting values based ideas. I mean, we just went through our 3-year member strategic planning session. And we've got tons of cool projects. Some of them will make it through, some of them won't, depending on resources and depending on alignment and time. But having all those ideas from 24, 25 people coming in, feeding in, and filtering through and knowing they're aligned with the business and what we want to do as a co-op has been pretty cool to see.
Thank you for that. It's a vulnerable answer to be like, we had a reckoning 6 or 7 years ago when we recognized, and I think it's not for a lack of intentionality. However, I had the privilege of hanging out with a CEO in Newfoundland this weekend, and he was talking about how culture eats strategy for breakfast, but how lack of clarity kills culture. And it sounds like when you have so much interest and desire for impact, if that's too broad and too widespread, then you end up adding sides to your desk and you end up getting less and less done. But with that reckoning happening, being able to create a sense of clarity, of unification, then you're all kind of pulling in the same direction and you're able to speak to that impact, probably with an opportunity to continue to evolve and increase how you're able to kind of laser focus that target. It's a juggling act that we're all trying to balance.
We had a real allergic reaction to the idea of profits for a period of time. It was this sense of guilt that comes along with the fact we might be making money. And sometimes you get that from even from customers. You're trying to also, have customers that appreciate the work that you're doing. And you always, there's this kind of, we were following this desire around to, meet the customer's expectation and, not make the bad word profits. And in the end, though, we can't do anything good if we're not bringing in money and running the business and allowing it to sustain itself, and then having that money to invest in the good things that we are doing. So there was a bit of epiphany that came where we just had to kind of shed the sense of guilt over having surpluses and move on. And then I think people are really, as a co-op, are benefiting from that now.
I love that. The incomparable Lauren Sears always says purpose led, not purpose bled.
This idea of profit versus surplus, it's not how much profit you make, it's how you use it and how you repurpose it. Let me pick up the thread where you said you have had this 3-year reflection period with your worker members. What are some of the key hopes and dreams that you have as a collective right now?
It's a really good question. I mean, we're still kind of solidifying where this is going to go for it'll start next year. But what I found was really interesting was a very broad consensus around the interest in just us supporting some form of cooperative housing for its members, affordable housing that's cooperatively focused. And there's a few different streams I can speak to as far as those sessions. We had 2 days worth of discussions. We actually paid a visit to Glooscap First Nation and rented their space, and we kind of were in the community, and we were doing this brainstorming there with a good friend of ours, Frank Gallant, who's an Antigonish with Peak Experiences, who's really been really helpful over the last couple of years with helping us to develop some of this. But because we all know housing is a challenge, particularly affording it, whether it's renting it or owning a home, there was a strong consensus among a number of workers that we wanted to explore how do we partner, how do we, not necessarily do it on our own, because that would be a bit of a difficult challenge, as far as alignment with coffee business, right? But this was something that we explored a little bit, and we explored more broadly even, is there an umbrella that we could support the creation of, that our worker co-op Just Us could be part of, and also allow us to get into different interests that our membership has, but collaborate with other organizations, other businesses that have different expertise, so that we could better utilize what we do well to feed into a broader kind of co-op development umbrella organization. So there was a lot of interest. There's kind of this broader interest that existed. There was another interesting thing. I said earlier, we were big into regenerative organic agriculture and how that works. And we've been collecting coffee waste for a lot of years now. Out back, we compost it, and we're out in the rural part of the province, out in Grand Pre, and so we've got a parcel of land in behind that a number of workers have been using for vegetable plots over the last number of years. And more and more people are becoming interested in growing their own vegetables out back. We have the equipment, we have a greenhouse from a previous project that we closed down, but we're putting it back to use. And one of the big things that came out of a certain group of members was we want a real proper composting facility that we could even bring in some of our food wastes and do a proper job and really start to build the soil in our back gardens. So the ideas were as broad as an umbrella organization where we could, maybe invest some of our profits in things that weren't related directly to our coffee business, to a very grassroots kind of how do we build a composting facility to nourish the soil that will grow food for our workers in our community. So, that's just a couple of the ideas that came out of it, but neither of them talk about, a product that we're going to sell next year. That comes out of our annual business planning process that is also underway this year. We have 2 to do. So it's, there's a bit of added complexity given the structure of our organization. But some of those more business focused things also happen with a group of 12 to 15 emerging leaders, we call them, but it's more operationally focused. And it's kind of a 1-year basis. But the overall 3-year strategic plan, we're trying to achieve those things also in our annual plans, but we have to layer that. We kind of have that as the overarching landscape. And then we, as an operational team, are trying to figure out, well, what things can we do within the 3-year member plan over the course of the next year, and then the year after that. So there's multiple horizons we're kind of planning on, and multiple focuses depending on which perspective, which hat, an individual or a group of people are wearing at any given moment here in the worker co-op.
The idea of workers cooperative is not new, and yet what you just now have described, how it can be such a powerful business model, and some of your hopes and dreams of probably, if I may interpret that, transition from just not running a business but seeing so what, and how does it influence the orbits that you work in the local communities in the province. So if you were to articulate how can we make such experiments as business models expand and spread, what would your policy recommendations or suggestions would be? What will make that happen? I know it's a big question, but give us 1 or 2 key things.
It is a big question, and we've been exploring it for a few years now, because that's been one of our side projects, is particularly coffee businesses. How could we spur the generation of new either cafe worker co-ops or coffee roasting worker co-ops, to the point where we had our innovation program. We launched a project a couple of years ago. It started off, we called it the anti-franchise model project. It's almost like an upside down franchise scenario where, we could be kind of a hub for coffee businesses to get their supply of green coffee or their supply of roasted coffee, their expertise and training, even their bookkeeping, because we'd have that expertise. But people would have independent worker co-ops that, I guess there's some kind of agreement that would have to be in place, to kind of help make sure that we work together over a period of time. But we wanted to look at, well, how do you create these kind of smaller co-ops out of nothing? And we did a lot of work around that, but what we stumbled up against was people's lack of understanding and knowledge just around worker co-ops, period, and probably some misinformation or misunderstandings that they have around worker co-ops, which led us to start to think about, how do we promote the idea of worker co-ops? And if you go to business school, you don't learn about worker co-op. That's not one of the models that typically get talked about. Maybe it gets mentioned. So we spoke locally with the Acadia Entrepreneur Center about maybe getting maybe at least if they could mention that kind of model in that kind of a setting when entrepreneurs come and talk about starting a business. But, when you go to a lawyer to start to incorporate your business, they don't talk about a worker co-op, right? So there's a real lack of foundational understanding around worker co-ops, and what understanding does exist isn't necessarily accurate. I think it gives people a sense of it's an old-fashioned thing that fishermen used to do, or or it's a thing that, only hippies that don't want to actually run a real business will do. There's this general sense of things, but when I look at the current generation of folks up and coming into the workplace, it is so in line with their general philosophy and value set, to the point where we thought, well, how do we do, we need to promote this thing. We need to make this thing become a cool idea that folks know about. But it's a struggle because there's a lack of co-op developers these days. We're trying to spur an event in October in Halifax. We're hoping to bring Atlantic co-op developers and interested folks together to get that beyond just our co-op. The problem is, as a business, we're a co-op running a business. And so we get interested in these things when we have time, and then suddenly we get busy because things are challenging and they fall off our plate. We need an organization that can help carry that on its own. And there isn't that right now. And but I think we're in desperate need of it. And I think this is the moment where it can really happen. Everything's so aligned to do that. So I think it's a really good question, but I think there's a lot of challenges, and it's mostly kind of cultural and educational that's in the way.
I just can't help but feeling so excited listening to that. And hopefully, just good business can play a small role in that education and that amplifying your voices and your work, and really look at the business model and the details of it and create those learning spaces for those who want to engage. As you rightly said, young people are very aligned to this whole idea, but they don't always know how to go about doing it.
Hmm.
Also, as the resident hippie here who is holding back his hair with his headphones, I'd say I definitely empathize and agree. And I would suggest that there are numerous organizations that can identify as social enterprising or having social enterprising activities, be they, B Corp structure or a CIC structure or a co-op structure. That aren't nearly as explored as possible. And you said it at the beginning when you're talking about how we have to decolonize. And decolonizing is really, really important when it comes to business structures as well. And this is an opportunity to do that. So when it comes to, policy can be a 4-letter word sometimes when it comes to trying to reinvent and restructure policy work. But I'd be curious to know, Joey, on your end, your advice for any one person looking to shift towards a social entrepreneurial model or creating social entrepreneurial impact in what they do.
Well, the first thing I'd say is get in touch with folks that are doing that work. Building that network. And unfortunately, it doesn't just exist quite yet where you can kind of tap into it and kind of, I think to some degree there are things there, there's certainly, the social enterprise world, I think, has made a whole lot of progress in the last few years, far more than the worker co-op concept has. But you need to have an open mind and go and talk to the folks that are running worker co-ops. And I'm going to speak specifically to worker co-ops because that's what I know best. I mean, we're by definition a social enterprise just because of the way we structure our business, and I think we also do some things business-wise that fall under that category. But we have to understand that complexity doesn't have to be a bad thing. When we structure our business a little bit more in a worker co-op model, we have to be open to the fact that a lot of richness and a lot of resilience is built into your organization because of that complex structure. And it doesn't mean that everybody's got to make the decision is here at Just Us whether or not we sell our coffee to this company or that company. We don't need everybody to decide that. We've got people that have responsibilities. So I think that that's a big piece to reach out. We've spoken with a number of people entertaining the idea of the worker co-op, but also I think there are actually resources out there to help us get there. There's a few. The Canadian Worker Co-op Federation is one. There's Co-op Convert has a lot of research and case studies on co-ops. So it is really about getting out and doing your research. And I think it's also about if we are going to decolonize, Matt, like if we are really going to look at that model, we have to get out of our individualism mindset a little bit. And that's the beauty of the worker co-op. Getting out of the bro entrepreneur kind of concept we see going crazy these days. Even if you're social enterprise, I feel that that's a lot of what the focus is. But when you're creating an organization from community, which is what you're doing in a worker co-op, it's a complicated group. It's more than 3 or 4 people typically. It means you have to be an entrepreneur, but you have to also have a generosity of spirit that only comes in community when you care about one another, because your idea is going to get transformed. It's going to change because you've got multiple people involved in driving this business idea forward. So I think that's ultimately where some of our challenges worker co-ops comes from, is that the culture that we live in doesn't create the context for worker co-op structures, for democratic economies. We want to vote every 4 years for a government, and that's our form of democracy. But when we could actually experience it on a daily basis at our workplace, we think, oh, it's too complicated. Businesses can't be run that way. And I think it's a big mistake. But we do have to slow down. Like, that's the challenge. As businesses, sometimes you have to move quickly, and that doesn't jive with slowing down and working within community to make decisions. I get it, but there are ways to do it. And if we're willing to look to others who are doing it for support on how to structure that and then build it into be our own thing over time, I think we can do that. But we need starting places that are tangible, that we can dig our feet into a little bit, learn our business, run our business, be successful at our business. And then over time, we'll see that the community that is that worker co-op will change what it wants out of its co-op, because it's mature and it understands that, and because that community relationship exists. And that's when it can evolve into what, maybe more appropriate for that group of people. Policy, I don't know. I'm not a policy person, but I can speak to the human dynamics and the group dynamics that exist in a worker co-op, and why sometimes they feel like you're really climbing uphill trying to get traction on the worker co-op concept.
It sounds like the way that you're describing it, that it's a structure that can fundamentally align with where culture is as far as the individuals that are entering the workforce, however, may not be where workplace culture and structure has become. So it's an opportunity to help shift that furthermore.
Mm-hmm.
You may not be a policy person, but you definitely are a philosopher. Thank you so much to you, to taking time off to talk to us, to your incredible team. We as Just Good Business have identified this gap on how do we really identify and amplify the social enterprise network and space in our province. We have realized social enterprise is not a destination, it's a journey, it's a meandering journey. And how do we get into that space intentionally? So thank you so much.
To learn more about Just Us, visit justuscoffee.com. Throughout the episode, Joey refers to their structure as a worker co-op. It's an interesting structure, and you can learn more at canadianworker.coop.
When you enjoy fresh roasted Just Us coffee, you join in a circle of empowered partners who work towards positive social impact and community well-being. Just Us products are available throughout Atlantic Canada and Ontario.
Go grab yourself a cup of Joe. If you liked what you heard today, subscribe to tune in for more. I'm Matt.
And I'm Anuj. And this has been Just Good Business Podcast.